Within history, there have been numerous instances of a people fighting for a home. In 1948, the small area of Israel declared its independence as a fully functional country. Surrounded by tension on all sides, Israel was in a position to be crushed by the powerful Arab armies surrounding it, including Egypt, Syria, and Jordan. Israel, as a country, proved to the world that as a people, fighting for a home is one of the most powerful inspirations, and that a small country can prove to be an axis for a turning point in history. The strategic planning, as well as the efficiency of the Israeli Defense Force, led to the eventual conclusion that resulted in a sudden skew in the direction of history. Israel declared its independence as a country in 1948 after a long struggle with the surrounding Arab countries, resulting in the death of 6,000 soldiers. As a country, she was always under constant pressure from the surrounding nations. This led to a large amount of minor outbreaks along the border of the country, especially with the Arab nation of Syria. After repeated violent activity along the border, Israel conducted a minor invasion in 1966 and took over the Jordanian village of As-Samu. This resulted in a joint defense pact between Jordan and Egypt as to prevent any other form of military action by Israel. However, the tension between Israel and her surrounding adversaries continued to grow. Over the next couple of years, terrorist activity along her border and military action from Syria grew to a point of almost constant harassment. Israel, too, began to respond and provoke the beast that was Syria by staging numerous provocations on the border. This led to serious concern for the actions along the border to go into paranoia, fearing that Israel planned to invade and overthrow the regime of Syria. Due to a serious complication on the border, Israel and Syria began to produce tanks, artillery, and infantry. Israel produced an immediate counterattack, resulting in the bombing of several Syrian villages. After large amounts of fire exchanged on both sides, foreign powers were able to break up the fighting that was taking place. By this time, the rest of the Arab countries were beginning to mass together to discuss their common foe, Israel. During both conflicts, Egypt and Jordan were criticized for refusing to grant military aid to Syria. After the initial fighting, heavy apprehension still existed between Israel and Syria, to the point of Israel threatening serious military action against Syria. Egypt's leader, Gamal Abdel Nasser, received intelligence from the Soviet Union that Israel already planned to launch a full-scale attack on Syria. Despite the invalidity of the claims, Nasser began to arrange his troops on the Sinai Peninsula, bordering Israel. By now, Israel and Syria were at the point of constantly exchanging various threats. Nasser continued to amass his troops along the border of Israel, only working to increase the constantly growing strain on the entire situation. The final tipping point that forced the Israeli army into the Six-Day War was Nasser's decision to close the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping. Israel had before declared that any action to attempt to restrict or prevent the passage of Israeli ships through the strait would be considered an act of war. Nasser was recorded as publicly declaring, "Our basic objective will be the destruction of Israel. The Arab people want to fight." In May of 1967, Nasser joined forces with Syria. Jordan encouraged Iraqi military action. Soon the surrounding Arab countries were all preparing for military action against Israel. In the beginning of June, Israel began to prepare for the decision to go to war. On June 4th, 1967, Israel made the decision to fight. Israel, on the morning of the first day of the war, launched several bombing runs against the Egyptian Air Force. Israel's preparations were their first step in their strategy in the coming war. Extensive practices were conducted by the Air Force, as well as long hours of training for individual pilots. For each fighter airplane, it was previously believed that they could complete 3 offensive runs in a single day, or 3 sorties. This included the time to fly to a designated target, fire a payload, turn around, return to the home airfield, refuel, rearm, and take off again. However, due to the severe performance of the Israeli army, they were able to average 5 runs per day per plane. This resulted in the destruction of the majority of the Egyptian Air Force. Israel continued to perform several strafing runs on numerous other Arab airfields. This resulted in immediate air superiority for Israel for the remaining days of the war, and greatly hindered any attempts for air support for the other Arab countries. After the war, this interview with King Hussein of Jordan was recorded.
The battle was waged against us mainly from the air, almost exclusively from the air, with such overwhelming strength and continued sustained air attack on every single unit, on every single formation of our armed forces, day and night, right?
It allowed them to project their force over vast distances using relatively few assets. Operationally, it meant that they could be mobile between the various fronts. Because they had so many enemies surrounding them, they knew that they would very probably have to fight one after another after another.
Israel then proceeded with its attack on the West Bank, Sinai Peninsula, and the Gaza Strip. The ground fighting was extensive and difficult. Israel was forced to defend herself on all sides. The Egyptian ground forces, armed with battalions, artillery, and more than 100,000 troops, were advancing along the Sinai Peninsula to the west of Israel. In addition, the Syrian army began to advance towards the Golan Heights on the northeast corner of Israeli territory. The Israeli response to the Egyptian attack was to mass on the border between Israel and the Sinai Peninsula. The Israelis took a strategic approach and surprised the much larger Egyptian army with a flanking approach by traveling north and attacking. After hours of fighting, the Israeli Defense Force was able to force the Egyptians back towards the border of Egypt. The Egyptians' loss, despite their large numbers, can be attributed to the lack of motivation within the army, along with the serious lack of central leadership. Here's Eric Nussbacher on the attack of the Sinai and the Egyptian soldier.
Once this plan has been developed by the Egyptian general staff, Nasser changes his mind. Because of his bellicose rhetoric, Nasser has to abandon the idea of using his army to defend Cairo, to defend the Sinai against an Israeli attack, and instead he has to go along with his bellicose rhetoric and position his army to attack.
The fight on the West Bank, however, was a different story. King Hussein of Jordan was initially hesitant to join the war. However, Nasser manipulated him into believing that the Egyptian forces had penetrated Israel. Jordanian units attacked Israel at the West Bank. Israel forces began to fight a defensive battle and sent several messages to Jordan calling for them to pull out of the war. However, King Hussein replied that it was too late and continued his attack. However, a meeting of the Israeli cabinet resulted in the decision to stage a counterattack against Jordan. With Egyptian reinforcements en route, Israel had to act quickly. In a joint attack, the Israeli Air Force destroyed 2 Jordanian Air Force bases along with attacking Iraqi bases along the way. The Egyptian soldiers attempted to break through Israeli lines to attack an airfield on foot, but were prevented from reaching the base after being detected. Fighting continued in Jerusalem near the West Bank of Israel, and after artillery and bullets were exchanged, the Israelis were able to weaken Jordanian forces. One of the final offensives was on the Golan Heights. The Syrian Air Force attacked Israel, but the Israeli response resulted in the bombing of the remaining Syrian airfields and runways. The Golan Heights were then advanced upon by Israeli army. The Syrians had heavily fortified their positions, and the unique terrain of the Golan Heights made it difficult to maneuver with vehicles. Despite heavy fortifications, the Israeli army was able to break through the Syrian defenses, due mainly to the lack of effective leadership on the Syrian side, and the Israelis carried better offensive weapons for the terrain, specifically Uzis designed for close combat quarters. The Israeli army continued to advance into the Syrians' defensive areas, and despite heavy losses, were able to push through and drive the Syrians back. A soldier was recorded as stating, "The Syrians fought well and bloodied us. We beat them only by crushing them under our treads and by blasting them with our cannons at very short range, from 100 to 500 meters." The Jordanians were now in retreat. As the Israeli army advanced, they were met with less and less resistance. On June 10, 1967, the Israeli army advanced and fortified, finally ceasing attack. In front of where the army ceased was a long plain of fat land, and this became the symbolic ceasefire line. As a result of the fighting, Israel had successfully seized the Gaza Strip, the Sinai Peninsula, and the Golan Heights, along with the west bank of the Jordan River. Israel, however, later returned the Sinai Peninsula in return for a peace agreement. However, after several years, Israel was able to occupy and permanently acquire Gaza and the West Bank. However, the political and historical influence of the war in the Middle East resulted in a large amount of mixed reactions in the Middle East, and in the UN even. Even after the war, a state of tense uneasiness existed between the Arab countries. However, one thing was clear. Israel, despite it still not being recognized as a country by many Arab states, was powerful enough to perform strategic military operations capable of defending itself against various military opponents. The Six-Day War set the stage for further discord in the Middle East, resulting in further fighting over many different issues. Eventually, Jordan and Syria accepted the United Nations Security Council Resolution 242, which required Israel return the Sinai and parts of Gaza and the West Bank. However, for Israel and the Middle East, Israel's military proclamation of existence was a humongous turning point for history as a whole.